You are listening to Exploring Santa Cruz, and today we have a very, very special guest. His name is Dave Feliz.
Feliz, yes.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
And he's come to us as the manager of the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. That's a long title. Dave, I know this is a very magical place we're going to talk about today because I've been there, but I'm wondering if there's anybody in the world who doesn't know what an estuary is and doesn't know what a slough is and doesn't know what the difference is. So could you just explain that to us?
Sure. I think there's lots of people that don't know what a slough is because it's a little bit vague. And I think we define a slough as a meandering body of water. It could be tidal. It could be intermittent. There are sloughs in the Central Valley that are kind of like creeks, but I guess they dry out and are called sloughs. And estuaries are places where rivers run into salt water from the ocean and create a unique habitat of brackish water and marshes. And so most of our estuaries in California have been severely degraded by people's presence, but this is one that is on a different path.
And what is that different path?
Well, I'd say it started way back in the late 60s, early 70s, when there were plans to do some major development in the Elkhorn Slough to create some marinas, and there was even a plan to dock submarines in the area. And at that time, there was a new mindset developing about our coasts and that we should be protecting our coasts, and so there was some opposition in the local community and set us on a path of conservation. And so the Elkhorn Slough is pretty much dedicated to conservation, with a lot of the land in public ownership. Part of it is in a reserve that is managed by myself and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and federal agency NOAA, along with the Elkhorn Slough Foundation.
And I know that one of the key points about this reserve is that it has an amazing diversity. Birds, mammals, fish, invertebrates. The figures are birds more than 300 species, mammals some 59 species, fish well over 100 species, and invertebrates, the figure that I read was 500, more than 500 species. So can you give us some examples of this diversity and then help us to understand why this particular place will have so much diversity?
Well, there's really nowhere like it on the California coast. Nearby in the uplands is the southern end of the Santa Cruz Mountains, where there's redwood forest, and then we come down into oak woodlands and grasslands in our local watershed, going down into riparian areas, willow forest and salt marsh and open water of the bay. And when the slough enters into the ocean, it enters into Monterey Canyon, which drops down thousands of feet. And so that is quite a diversity of topography that's happening there, that's creating amazing diversity of habitats and wildlife. Everything from humpback whales and seabirds close to shore to endangered salamanders living in the forest in the Elkhorn watershed.
I was down there myself just to have some idea of what it's like. I had 2 different kayak trips in addition to hiking and going to your visitor center, which is a really special place that I recommend to everyone. And just in the very short time that I was there, I saw sea otters, which everybody loves, and then harbor seals and brown pelicans, egrets, cormorants, hawks, and a whole lot more. So that must be one of the things that draws people to come there. I know that you have to balance access to the public and the protection of the wildlife and the protection of all the different species. And also I know that you have some regard for the interests of fishermen and others. So how do you balance all those different things?
Well, I think it's kind of inherent in the mission of the department is that we manage native species in the state of California for their intrinsic value and then for use by the public. So we have to manage that use. So at the reserve, then we have one legal point of access, which is right through our visitor center, and we maintain trails and ask people to stay on the trails. And then out on the slough itself, it's really quite a scene there, especially on weekends now. There's quite an ecotourism scene that's just blossoming in Moss Landing, and any typical weekend there's dozens of kayaks out there. And so there is, a little bit of concern about the sea otters that have inhabited the slough, just really have just come back in the last 20, 25 years or so. But there is a little concern that we don't want to love these animals to death, and people want to get close to them. And so we work with the local businesses in Moss Landing and share information and make people aware of potential disturbance of these animals. And so there's guidelines on how close you should get to the wildlife, which carries on to everywhere you go that there's wildlife and you intend to photograph them or get a good look at them. It's important to treat them with respect and give them some distance. Definitely, public use needs to be managed. We don't want to love the Elkhorn slough to death.
No, we certainly don't want to do that. When you were talking about what could have happened to it, what could have taken all this wonderful reality from the state and from the public, I know they were talking about putting in lots and lots of condos and putting in a nuclear power plant and taking the harbor and letting petroleum-carrying ships come in and load and unload, and that just would have been unthinkable. So this really is a treasure, a California treasure, a national treasure, and it has been declared already this year, I think, an international treasure, has it not?
Absolutely. It was recently declared a wetland of international importance per the Ramsar Convention. There's very few of these in the world. I think there's 33 in the United States. It's very, very much worthy. There's several criteria that need to be met, and I think only one or two need to be met to be considered, and we excelled in every single one of them. Just the diversity of habitats and wildlife there is tremendous. And just the fact that the state thought it was a good idea to buy land there starting in the early 1980s to create the Elkhorn Slough Reserve and to create the Moss Landing Wildlife Area. And the nonprofit Elkhorn Slough Foundation is protecting land in the watershed, and they own about 4,400 acres nearby. They sort of clean up land use there. If there's some farming going on steep hillsides that puts lots of sediment into the slough, they may try and acquire this land and make a more sustainable operation on that property. And we've seen a direct correlation between land use and water quality. And water quality is really a driver of the diversity of wildlife that's going to be in those waters. So it's really a multi-pronged effort, lots of interest, lots of organizations involved, both conservation organizations and universities, and lots of research going on at the slough to learn even more about what's going on there.
We'll get to some of that research because there is a lot going on. But you just mentioned water quality in relation to the agriculture in the watershed. And I know that the foundation is really doing a good job in trying to acquire as much of that as they can in order to protect it. But how is the water quality? Because you don't have all the farms yet. Is there a problem still with runoff from agriculture, and how can you deal with that?
Yeah, there actually is. We receive water from the Salinas River in the lower Salinas. It comes into the south part of the Moss Landing Harbor and then is brought in with the high tides. And the water in the lower Salinas, Tembladero Slough, just south of Moss Landing, that's some of the most polluted water in the country. Very, very high in nitrates, and so those nitrates are brought in with the high tide, which causes tremendous blooms of algae, creates a lot of problems in the area. So we are affected by this watershed that extends 200 miles inland, the Salinas River watershed. And then in the Elkhorn Slough watershed, which is much smaller, there's a lot less fresh water than there used to be, mainly because of groundwater withdrawal. So we've got essentially pretty salty water throughout the slough, and we do get some freshwater runoff during rain events and things like that. But yeah, the excess nitrates, it creates lots of fertilizer, creates a lot of phytoplankton and then zooplankton that becomes very productive, uses up all the oxygen at night. We can get very low levels of dissolved oxygen in that water and then get die-offs of things like fish and invertebrates. So it can be pretty serious at times.
That sounds a bit scary. Are there easy solutions for it, or is this something that will take a long, long time to try and correct?
Well, one thing we can do is keep the water moving, and so there are places that are diked off, and water control structures control the water that goes in and out of there. So there's very little water exchange, and so those are areas that are especially bad in terms of water quality. But there's other reasons why we cannot open those areas up to tidal action. We have a county road that's pretty low in elevation. It would be flooded out at high tide. And so these are some of the challenges that we're looking at. And this is all exacerbated by sea level rise that we predict will be happening in the coming decades. But definitely changing land use affects water quality. Organic operations that have adequate sediment basins that catch sediment and catches any chemicals that are attached to that sediment and holds it in ponds to prevent it from coming into the slough. These are a couple of measures that can be taken to keep things better.
I know that you've just received a $1 million grant to do some additional restoration. I believe that there was more land that came into the reserve that is going to be restored with that grant. Can you tell us what that involves? How do you restore land that's been degraded and you suddenly want to make it a productive part of the reserve?
Sure. Well, there's lots of areas in the Elkhorn Slough that were diked off and used for other purposes, used as pasture or used as hunting clubs. And while they were diked off and separated from tidal inundation, they shrank in elevation, or they dropped in elevation, and so they're sitting about 2 feet too low to sustain salt marsh. And so when they were opened up to tidal action again, the water was too deep for salt marsh to grow, and so everything drowned. So then you have no plants holding the sediment in place, and with the increased flows coming in and out of the slough because of a channel that was built in the 1940s to create the Moss Landing Harbor, that construction of that channel just exponentially increased the tidal prism of the slough, and so a lot more water going back and forth, a lot more velocity with the flows of water, a lot more erosion, and with no plants to hold the sediment in place, the slough been eroding away. And so one solution that a program called the Tidal Wetlands Program came up with, a program that convenes interest from throughout the area, from local communities, local scientists, to discuss the impacts of salt marsh there and the loss of salt marsh and how to address that. Their solution was to raise the marsh plain to an elevation that will sustain salt marsh. And so we just finished phase 1 of what's called the Hester Marsh Restoration Project. I believe it's about 69 acres. And we raised the ground there from 2 to 3 feet in elevation. And most of the dirt came from a farm next door that we owned. However, the well on that farm went salty because of saltwater intrusion into the aquifer that it was drying from. And that's a problem throughout coastal Monterey County there at the mouth of the Salinas River, is that the ocean is getting in the aquifers because we're removing so much water from the ground. Anyway, our well went salty, which put our farm out of business, and so we're borrowing dirt from that farm to put out on the marsh plain. And we just finished construction in August of about 69 acres of marshland that has been reconstructed. It's been raised 2 to 3 feet, and then we cut the tidal channels that were existing in 1931, and we have a 1931 aerial photo, and we can reconstruct those tidal channels that we see in that photo and put those back in place. So we have rebuilt the marsh to an elevation that's pretty high. It's pretty high marsh, and will only go underwater maybe 8 times a year. So there will not be a lot of erosion there. There's not a lot of flow. It's not inundated very often, but it's low enough that it will grow pickleweed. And just in the last few weeks, we're starting to see lots and lots of pickleweed that is volunteering on its own and growing out on the marsh plain. On the edge of the marsh, we planted over 30,000 plants, both plants of what we call the ecotone, the area between the marsh plain and the uplands, where there's kind of a mix of habitats. So we've got lots of plants in there, and then lots of native grasses that are growing a little further upslope. So we've basically put back together about a 69-acre marsh, and that was phase 1. And so now we're moving on to phase 2, and this grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service completes the funding package that we need to continue with phase 2. So we just have a couple more permits to get in line, and then we'll move on to phase 2 and continue that good work of raising the marsh plane.
Now, you mentioned pickleweed, and I imagine there's a lot of people, myself included, before I went there, who had never heard of pickleweed, and yet I understand it has some remarkable qualities and really is important for the health of the reserve. Can you explain how the pickleweed works and what it does?
Yeah, pickleweed is our dominant plant in our salt marsh, and that is not the case in all salt marshes, especially on the East Coast. You don't see much pickleweed. But you do see pickleweed wherever conditions are very salty because it can tolerate very high salt levels. In fact, you see it in Death Valley. In some of these very salty creeks, you see pickleweed marshes, which is pretty amazing. But pickleweed can live in very salty conditions. It concentrates salt on the surface of the plant. If you bite into some pickleweed, you get a very salty flavor there. But it's also, pickleweed has a lot of structure, a lot of root structure and stem structure, and so that's a lot of surface area for microorganisms to grow on in the salt marsh, and it provides habitat for a variety of wildlife.
What is the wildlife that it gives habitat for?
Oh well, when it's inundated, then small fish can go through there, and invertebrates will burrow in the base of the pickleweed, and also our marsh that we're building is fairly high in elevation, so animals like shorebirds that forage in the mudflats, they'll rest in the pickleweed during high tides when they can't forage. And most recently, in the last 20 years or so, sea otters have come into the Elkhorn Slough and become very well established. We probably have 120 sea otters on any given day in the Elkhorn Slough. Our sea otters like to rest in the pickleweed, especially the mothers and their pups. They get into the tidal channels, and the nearby marsh is covered in pickleweed, and they get out on the pickleweed and lay in the sun and groom their young. So it's a loafing and resting area for sea otters as well as the shorebirds and all the other wildlife.
Wow, and what brought the otters back? Why did they come in if they weren't there before?
Well, that's a pretty good question. You know, we think of sea otters as living out in the rough surf and getting battered by the waves, and the last otters left here in the southern part of the range were off the coast of Big Sur, and it was just a dozen or so animals, and they've since done very well, expanded their range, and so they've expanded north enough to reinvade the Elkhorn Slough. It was first noticed probably about 25 years ago, but it was just occasional animals. And also what's been happening is the Monterey Bay Aquarium has been releasing animals into the slough, animals that had gone through rehabilitation, animals that may have been orphaned or brought in and that they saved. And so for years they were releasing animals into the slough, and they formed the core of the current population. And we learned that the sea otters in the Elkhorn Slough, they behave very differently from the sea otters in the ocean. About 4 years ago, we captured and tagged 25 animals. While they had them in hand, they took measurements and weighed them, and they were very healthy animals. In fact, they were a little larger than normal. And when they started looking at their behavior, and we put together a research project, and a lot of our volunteers took this on, started watching otters every day for 3 years, and along with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the USGS and the Monterey Bay Aquarium, this 3-year study went on observing sea otter behavior, and that we found that these sea otters spend less time feeding themselves than they do in the ocean, and that's because it's easier to do. It's easier to feed yourself. In the Elkhorn Slough, you're only diving in 3 or 4 feet of water and getting crabs and invertebrates. You're not diving 60 feet and getting beat up by waves, and so they can feed themselves quicker and their young quicker, so they have time on their hands, and they spend it, ensuring the safety and care of their young. The mothers, they actually have time to rest out on the pickleweed with their young, and they'll groom them there. And we have a camera that is watching these otters, and so if you go to elkhornslough.org and look up the otter cam, if you really want to reduce your productivity for the day, you can put on the otter cam and watch the sea otters and be enthralled by their behavior. It's really incredible. We have a high-density camera with sound, and this thing is observing behavior that was unknown a few years ago, and certainly not seen very often, of otters caring for their young, and of feeding behavior and mating behavior, and births have been captured on the film. It's really quite amazing.
That sounds like a good thing to do during the day, and just
Yeah, it really
kick back
is.
and watch the otter cam.
And it was an extraordinary citizen science effort. This team of volunteers that was put together to observe these otters. And the same volunteers also looked over the Hester Marsh restoration. We were required to monitor marine mammal behavior to make sure we weren't disturbing these animals. And so we had a team of expert citizen scientists that kept an eye on the otters, and they got a little curious. They certainly were not harmed by the project, and we hope that 69 acres will soon be inhabited by mother sea otters and their pups.
That's fantastic. Talking about that brings me to something that I do want to get to, and that is your outreach. I know that you're working with the public. You're also working with school children, local school children, and some of them quite young, right? Just in early elementary school. Could you tell us a bit about that? Because they're going to be the next generation to protect these lands.
Yeah, absolutely. We really feel that we need to get the next generation up to speed on what they have here in their backyard. And so we have an extensive education program, everything from kindergartners through college kids, and even professional development workshops for professionals. We probably have about 8,000 school kids a year that come through the reserve, and they're all coming with teachers that have received some instruction on how to interpret the slough and how to get the most out of a trip to the Elkhorn Slough. And we also have an after-school program with the local elementary school, Elkhorn Elementary. And so we have 2 age groups, and they come every other Wednesday. So every Wednesday there's a school bus comes at 1 in the afternoon, and these kids come out. And now the program's been around for 5 years, I believe. And so we have kids that have gone through 4 years of coming to the slough every Wednesday, and they definitely know that place and feel like they are a part of the staff, and I feel like they are too. So we are graduating another class as we speak, and we just looked at some of their projects on Wednesday. It's just great to see these kids that get excited about sea otters, and then they learn on their own and put together a little project about it. We also work with the Monterey Bay Aquarium. They bring high school students over, something called the Watch program, and they're working with Watsonville High, Pajaro Valley High, and Aptos High School. These kids come out every Friday in the fall, and they conduct experiments out in the field there. They collect data, so they have to figure out how to design an experiment, how to collect that data, what to do with that data. And then they put together presentations about their project, and it's quite a transformation. They show up as typical teenagers, only talking to their friends and looking at their phones, and when it's all over, they're dressed up in an auditorium, giving professional level presentations about scientific inquiry. That's really a great thing, and I think in all these programs we're turning these kids on to the possibility that conservation could be a career for them, and that they can study it in college, and they can get a job working at a wildlife area or an ecological reserve like the Elkhorn Slough.
That's fantastic. And in the minute that we have left, you mentioned volunteers. Is there a way that people in the public who are not attending these schools can volunteer?
Oh, absolutely. We have an active volunteer program. People can just go to the website and elkhornslough.org and look at the volunteers, and the person you want to contact is Aerial Hunter. You can volunteer to come help work in the greenhouse, or come do hard labor, or work with the kids, or lead tours. There's a variety of activities that people can get involved in. We probably have about 75 volunteers that are active there at the slough. And that program goes back to the very early days.
Thank you so very much. There's so many more questions I'd like to ask you, but we've kind of run out of time. But I have the feeling this isn't going to be the last program that we do on the Elkhorn Slough, and I really do appreciate your coming today. I just want to remind you that you're listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, K-Squid 90.7 FM on the dial, and ksqd.org on the web.